safely call our clump of hot seething gas, now that fusion reactions have begun, deuterium is being made, and those deuterium nuclei are starting to accumulate. And sooner or later, one of these deuterium nuclei will collide with a proton. In fact, this is almost certainly going to happen because the presence of a neutron makes it a lot heavier than a single proton, and it also makes the whole thing a lot bigger. Protons don't have to get as close to collide so that the repulsive force never gets so strong, and all that extra mass means there's a stronger force behind the collision to defeat the repulsion. If a single proton has to wait 1 billion years to collide with another proton, a deuterium nucleus only has to wait about 4 seconds. What a difference that neutron makes. So, when a proton barrels into a deuterium nucleus, that's another different nuclear reaction. One proton and one proton-neutron pair collide, and they stick together. One photon comes out, and we now have an even bigger nucleus, 2 protons and a neutron. Now, an atom with 2 protons is no longer called hydrogen, it's helium, although it's a lighter form than what we normally find in nature. This helium nucleus has 3 subatomic particles, so we call it helium-3. The helium we normally find in nature has 4 particles, 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and we call it helium-4. So, now where we previously had 3 protons with a whole lot of kinetic energy, we now have a single nucleus made up of 2 protons and a neutron, a neutrino that's long gone by now, and 3 very high-energy photons. Under these conditions, a bunch of extra reactions can happen quite quickly as well, with various different collisions happening between different combinations of helium-3 nuclei, deuterium nuclei, and individual protons. Some of these reactions result in unstable heavy nuclei that then break down again, but the end result to all of them is the helium-4 that we are so familiar with. So we now have nuclear fusion, which is producing an awful lot of very high-energy photons, which can't go far before colliding with other particles and giving up their energy. Okay, so what does this mean for our cloud? Because up until now, we had this balancing act going on where the 2 forces, gravity pushing inwards and pressure pushing out, were all neatly balanced. But now we've got nuclear reactions adding large amounts of extra energy. So what happens next? 2 things, actually. First, a single helium atom takes up less space than 4 hydrogens. So that means there's now a little bit more space to go around. With more space to move, the molecules don't hit quite as hard or as often, so the pressure drops slightly. Less pressure means that gravity starts to gain ground and the core collapses slightly, contracting tighter until all that free space is gone again. But conversely, all those photons being created by the nuclear reactions drive the temperature up. They drive it up a lot. And higher temperature means a higher average speed for all those protons bouncing around, which means more pressure. More pressure means that collisions start happening more often. More collisions means more reactions, which means more heat, and round we go. But extra pressure also means that the core can now push back harder against gravity than it could before, so that it expands, relieving pressure, causing temperature to drop. And while all this instability goes on, outside gas is still falling in, crushing down ever harder and tighter than before, and adding to the heat and pressure in the core, fueling more and more nuclear reactions. Once again, we are at a place where something has got to give. Now, there's not much more that can happen in the core, at least not until the temperature goes all the way up to something like 100 million kelvins. That's when things are hot enough for the helium to start fusing. But right now, it just cannot happen. You see, all that heat, all those photons, they're enough that they're starting to escape. The core is hot enough, still at about 10 or 15 million kelvins, that the gas closest to it, that hot, thick, compressed stuff that's not quite there yet to begin fusion, is also heating up. It's also super hot. It's also a plasma in which all those molecules are smashed apart into a seething sea of loose protons and electrons, but it's not dense enough for any of those protons to ever collide directly. So you'd think it still behaves like a simple ideal gas, balancing pressure against gravity, but it doesn't. It's being heated up from beneath. That hot nuclear core is right there, touching it, raising its temperature so that its pressure also climbs way up. Not enough to fuse hydrogen atoms together, but enough to stop shrinking and stop falling inwards. These outer regions form into various layers, depending on just how big the star gets, but it's all super hot gas and plasma, and all that hot churning plasma generates powerful magnetic fields. The magnetic field, twisting and churning, interacts with the charged particles that created it, and the result is a mess, described by the horribly complicated branch of physics called magnetohydrodynamics. I'm not even going to try and explain what that's all about, except to say that you have the gas laws that we spent so much time talking about interacting with gravity to create convection currents. You know, the whole hot air rises, cold air falls idea. And that alone is enough to make some really complicated, funky, swirling currents. And since it's also hot, it's made from charged particles, and when charged particles move, you get magnetic fields. So all this churning, moving, charged fluid creates churning, moving, changing magnetic fields. And changing magnetic fields make charged particles move. So this already complicated system then complicates itself further, and the result is it's a mess. It's probably the hardest, most difficult branch of science to pick apart, although I'm sure as I say this that there are biologists out there who are angrily clearing their throats while writing strongly worded letters to explain exactly how hard their specific subfield is. So let me apologize in advance, because I don't want to fight, and I don't want to make out that other types of scientists are not as smart or hardworking or anything like that. My point is just that it's really, really, really hard to properly model what goes on in the roiling, seething body of a star between its core and its surface. What we do know, however, is that all that stuff is probably responsible for what we actually observe over and over again, which is that a combination of radiation pressure from photons and an actual physical wind of high-energy, high-velocity charged subatomic particles works to blow away the gas and dust that were on their way to fall into the star. When we look at stellar nurseries, huge clouds of gas and dust, we see young hot stars, huge clouds of gas and dust like what I've spent so much time talking about. If we look inside them with infrared telescopes that can see through the dust, we see young hot stars sitting in the middle of big bubbles inside the clouds. They are hot and they're energetic and they're blowing away their cocoons, and over time that original huge dust cloud that fed them and grew them from just little clumps of stuff into hot nuclear furnaces, it gets blown away until what was once a vast diffuse cloud hundreds of light years across is now a cluster of hot young stars. They all formed in the same cloud at very roughly, the same time, and now they're all loosely connected to each other gravitationally, spread out over an area that used to be a gas cloud. They're all pretty much made from the same stuff, the same proportions of hydrogen, helium, and whatever other trace gases might have been around, and the same types of dust, because they all came from the same cloud. But they're not all the same size. Some are truly titanic in size, larger than our entire inner solar system, while most are much smaller. Some got fed a lot of gas, the rest not so much. But they're all stars, and they're all new, and they're all hot and energetic, and they all have their futures mapped out ahead of them. Most will stabilize and then calmly burn for billions of years until they run out of fuel and go through another billion or so as red giants burning helium, but the largest of all will eventually detonate as supernovae. But before that can happen, a whole heap of interesting things have to happen first. And we'll be looking at that next episode. So, thank you for listening, and I hope you found this interesting and that you learned something new. If you have any comments, if you enjoyed this, or if you spotted an error that needs correcting, please reach out to me and tell me about it. You can mail me directly at podcast@urban-astronomer.com, or you can tweet me or leave a message on my Facebook page. My Twitter handle is @uastronomer, and my Facebook page is facebook.com/urbanastronomer. One word, no spaces or dashes or anything. If you can't find me, you can use the direct links on my website at www.urban-astronomer.com. You can also find subscribe links for the podcast if you're listening to this through an aggregator or on 365 Days of Astronomy. If you enjoy the show and know anybody who would also like it, you can help them find it by sharing a link to the website with them, or just tell them to search for Urban Astronomer Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher or any other directory. We are listed almost everywhere, but if you can't find us on your favorite directory, send me a note. I'll take care of it. Let's see what's next. Oh yeah, would you like to be a guest on the show? I am looking for guests and interviewees, so if you've ever wanted to break into podcasting, here is your chance. I am looking for basically anybody who has any connection to South African astronomy. Have a look at our previous guest list. We've got amateurs who love looking at the stars and who live in South Africa. We have spoken to Cassini mission scientists who discovered fascinating features of Saturn and its moons, who also happen to have been born here. We've had astronomy lecturers, a science journalist who enjoys looking at the stars, engineers who've worked on telescope control systems, and more. It doesn't matter how tenuous you think the connection is. If you have a passion for the subject and you want to share it with the world, send me an email to podcast@urban-astronomer.com and we'll see what we can arrange. One important detail though. As you look through the previous guest list, you might have noticed there's a certain demographic trend. If you're young, if you are not a white man, and you're wondering why there are so few people who look or sound like you, then I'm especially interested in hearing from you. I want to encourage young men and women in this country to follow their interest in astronomy, and that means showing examples of how other people have done that, or giving role models that you can aspire to. And given that white men like myself are a small minority in South Africa, it really doesn't make sense that they make up such a majority of my guests. And look, I'm not saying I don't want white men. You guys dominate my guest list. Obviously, I have no problem with you. I am you. But I want to talk to other people too. Yes, what I'm trying to say is, if you'd like to be on the show, but you don't want to be the only black guy in the room or the only woman in the room or whatever, well, I totally get that. But I would love to have you on anyway. And if you do, you make it easier for the next person, and we can start to grow into something just a little bit more representative of the country that I am trying to speak to. Finally, I just had a brilliant idea for a new project. You see, every now and then, I dip my toe into the turgid sea of flat earth believers. I've done a few podcast episodes, some blogs, and an awful lot of social media posts about the subject, and I tend to fall back to offering simple experiments that anybody can try at home to prove for themselves, one way or another, whether or not the Earth is truly a globe. And then I moan about how nobody ever tries these experiments because they are lazy and prefer to get all their information from random dodgy YouTube videos with authentically shaky handheld cameras and cheap animations. But what I just realized is that I've never tried to perform these experiments myself, so I'm going to do it. Now, these need to be on video, and I've never done video before, apart from a few time lapses of clouds and stars, so this is not going to happen tomorrow. I'm going to have to figure out what to actually do in front of the camera, how to perform the experiments in a way that makes sense to a viewer, and generally put together a workflow to get me from performing in front of the camera to having an edited, watchable video online somewhere. So if there are any vloggers or YouTubers listening who have any advice about how to go on about stuff like this, give me a shout. Yes, so I guess that's everything for this episode, so thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss the next episode, and clear skies.